The Ukrainian armed forces may not have been able to match their Russian opponents when it comes to the numbers of troops they can recruit or the tanks they can roll into battle, but they do have one advantage that matters more than almost anything else: home field advantage. They're fighting on their own turf. They know the lay of the land better than anyone else, and they know exactly how to use it to gain an edge on their enemies. It happens time and time again in key frontline territories, and it just happened once more at the boundary between the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. There, Russian units thought they'd forced the Ukrainians into full retreat, but what happened next caught them completely off guard. The incident occurred in the Serebryanski forest in Luhansk Oblast near Kreminna, close to the boundary with Donetsk. This dense forest extends across 265 acres of land beside the Seversky Donets River. It was once a peaceful natural reserve and wildlife haven. Now, since it's located right on the front lines of the conflict, it's a massive battlefield, and its tricky terrain, which is largely covered in trees but also includes some areas of swampland, makes it a difficult location for any armed force, be it Ukrainian or Russian, to occupy and travel through safely. Despite the challenges the forest poses, Ukrainian troops managed to maintain control of large parts of the area for several months. During that time, they gained a better understanding of the forest's layout and formed an intricate network of supply routes among the trees so that they could move people and supplies in and out relatively quickly. Unfortunately, Russians repeatedly bombarded the area and eventually pushed the Ukrainian forces back, using drones to gain control of the few viable logistic routes that Ukraine had managed to establish. However, while this may seem like a big win for the Russians at the time, Ukraine's forces soon found a way to turn the tables on their enemy, cleverly transforming their retreat into another tactical advantage. Because the Russians didn't do what the Ukrainians did. They didn't move into the forest and take time to learn the lay of the land and build their own unique web of supply lines. Instead, they just started using those same routes that the Ukrainians had set up in order to quickly funnel more troops and equipment through the area, preparing for the next offensive deeper into the Donetsk region. Since Ukraine's troops had spent so long in that area, they knew exactly which routes the Russians were going to use. So they started sending drones into the forest for perfectly precise strikes on Russian vehicles, personnel, and other assets. Military videos soon emerged from the area, showing the impact of these attacks. One of the clips shows a Ukrainian FPV fiber optic drone traversing almost the entire forest to track down and destroy a Russian UAZ Patriot vehicle, not far from the city of Kreminna in the Luhansk region. The drone struck its target with peerless precision, wiping the vehicle off the map and eliminating the Russian officer on board at the time. A second drone went in to scan the scene of the attack and confirmed the kill, demonstrating just how effective Ukraine's drone operations have become. Another incident involved soldiers from Ukraine's 63rd Brigade, who cleverly kept their drones out of sight as they tracked Russian supply trucks moving through the forest. They tailed the trucks all the way to a camouflaged Russian drone control point. The Russian forces likely thought they were perfectly hidden and had no chance of coming under any sort of enemy fire. But they were dead wrong. Once Ukrainian forces had identified the secret control post, they quickly conducted another precise strike, destroying both the position and the Russian drone operators who were using it at the time. On top of all of that, they also wiped out a nearby ammunition depot, dealing a massive blow to Russia's offensive capabilities in the Serebryanski forest, all in the blink of an eye. Now, these incidents were only made possible due to the fact that Ukraine soldiers knew the forest so well and had spent time there, learning the land and figuring out the best ways to traverse the trees and foliage. They used that knowledge to their advantage to flip the script on the Russians, who, despite seeming to have so much cover all around them, suddenly found themselves utterly exposed, vulnerable, and under fire. The Russian forces also weren't helped by the fact that there is little defensive infrastructure in the forest. Again, this is all down to Ukraine. Even though Ukrainian troops controlled the area for an extended spell of time, they didn't take the time to dig out lots of fresh trenches, tunnels, or set up many fortifications there. They had to leave quickly when the Russian attacks began, so left almost nothing behind for the enemy to use. Thanks to that, the Russian soldiers could only rely on the trees themselves for cover, and if they wanted to get a better defensive position, they'd have to dig trenches and construct fortifications of their own, which would take time, manpower, and resources. And given the fact that Russia's frontline troops are notoriously ill-supplied, with many also tired and weak due to a lack of food, water, and rest, they wouldn't have had much energy to construct anything of note. Indeed, reports state that troops in the area have simply been making the most of basic foxholes and improvised shelters here and there, which offer very little protection against artillery strikes and zero protection when it comes to drones, which can easily spot soldiers on the ground and wipe them out before they even have a chance to react. In effect, these Russian troops have a very small chance of survival, and unfortunately for them, their commanders have consistently shown a blatant disregard for the value of life. Time and time again, Russia has thrown scores of soldiers into the meat grinder, thrusting them forward along the front lines towards certain death, without any hope of reinforcement or even the option to retreat and live to fight another day. Instead, they must simply sit in the forest and await their fate. And it's not a pleasant fate. Another video captured in the area showed how Russian soldiers had attempted to conceal themselves in a tight dugout. There were so many of them inside, they had to leave their weapons and ammo outside, on the ground, just so that there would be enough space for all to fit. Tragically for them, that proved to be a disastrous move. Ukraine's drones were scanning the area when one operator spotted the stash of weapons and ammo and instantly understood what had happened. An attack began, and with just 4 munitions dropped on the zone, the dugout was destroyed, the armaments were wiped out, and the soldiers too met their untimely end. This story isn't a one-off occurrence. It's happening throughout the area, as the forest terrain makes it incredibly difficult for Russians to dig in and defend themselves. There's very little space to maneuver, and with trees all around, it's not like the troops can simply make trenches or set up strong shelters or bunkers to defend themselves or stash their supplies. They're basically exposed for every second they spend in Serebryanski, and that makes it almost impossible for them to maintain any kind of true control in the forest. The whole place is like one big death maze, with Ukrainian drones weaving their way through the trees, just waiting and watching for any sign of their enemy, ready to rain down hell in an instant. And the situation shows no signs of improving for the Russian forces. In fact, it's only likely to get worse in the days to come, and here's why. Just beyond the edge of the forest sits the rural settlement of Yampil in the Donetsk region. For now, Yampil is under Ukraine's control, but it's the next obvious target for the Russian forces. They clearly went to break through the forest, force Ukrainian troops out of Yampil, and establish a foothold there that they can use to push on for further attacks and land grabs deeper into Donetsk. But there are 2 problems with that strategy. First, the Russians are suffering so much within the forest itself, thanks to Ukraine's clever tactics, that they can't even get enough troops and supplies all the way through to mount any sort of serious offensive in the Yampil direction. It will likely take much more time for Russia to actually find a way to build up a sufficient force at the far end of the forest, and in that time, they'll continue to suffer greatly, with many troops either killed or injured, vehicles destroyed, and other assets and supplies taken out by Ukraine's drones. Secondly, because they're so focused on Yampil, the Russians' movements have become even more predictable. They were able to take control of one large trench fortification at the forest's edge, just across from the village, and Russian commanders clearly intend to use that location as a springboard for their next attack towards the settlement. But that also means that all Russia's troops and supplies are heading in that specific direction, towards that specific fortification, and then onward towards Yampil. Ukraine already had a full map of all the possible routes the Russians might take through the forest, and now it knows exactly where they're headed at all times. That makes it even easier for drone operators to pick off targets one by one, and it makes life dramatically harder for Russians as they desperately attempt to scramble their way through the zone. This was proven in a recent video shared by Ukraine's 81st Air Mobile Brigade. The clip shows a pair of surviving Russians, the last 2 members of an assault group, that managed to make it through the forest and into Yampil via the same route mentioned previously. With their comrades taken out, the pair decided to take shelter in a basement, but it wasn't sufficient to save their lives. Ukraine's drone operators honed in on their hideout, forcing the troops out into the open, where they were quickly taken out by infantry fire. This sort of thing is happening on a regular basis. Ukraine soldiers report regular sightings of small Russian groups breaking through the forest lines and proceeding onward into Yampil, but almost none of them survive, because drone operators are constantly monitoring that exact area, picking off the infiltrators like shooting fish in a barrel. Thanks to this, Russia's forces are never able to build up or gain any sort of momentum in the Yampil direction, and for the time being at least, Russian commanders are once again refusing to adjust their strategy. They continue to order small groups of troops along those same routes, right under the noses of Ukraine's drones, blindly and foolishly hoping that eventually somehow it will work out in their favor. If the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, then Russian commanders quite clearly fit the bill. And in many ways, the situation in the Serebryanski is almost a microcosm of the entire war. Up and down the front lines and elsewhere in Ukraine, Russia's military leaders have consistently persisted with their tactics. They've demonstrated an astonishingly stubborn inability to adjust their strategy, constantly following a brute force approach to the conflict, relying on numerical superiority to see them through to victory. It hasn't worked, but they still continue to rely on this tactic despite suffering extraordinary losses. A recently leaked internal document revealed the full extent of those losses, with official Russian sources admitting that over 281,000 of their troops had either been killed, wounded, gone missing, or been captured by Ukraine. The same leak also noted that Russia had permanently lost more than 13,000 pieces of military equipment, with close to 50,000 others damaged but still repairable. This demonstrates just how wasteful the Kremlin has been with its resources. Yes, it has the larger army and bigger supplies of tanks, armor, and other equipment, but it hasn't constructed a suitable strategy to make smart use of those advantages. It has instead simply thrown everything it can at Ukraine, hoped that it will be enough to strong-arm the opposition into submission, and simply counteracted losses by recruiting more men and manufacturing more equipment. It's not a sustainable strategy, and it has no chance of working out in Russia's favor in the long term, because the losses are mounting up by the day and will eventually be too costly for even the Kremlin to bear. And the same story is playing out in and around the Serebryanski forest, albeit on a smaller scale. There too, Russia is treating troops like cannon fodder, funneling more and more units into the area and watching as its personnel and its equipment, including vehicles and ammo, are blown to bits by Ukrainian drone strikes. But instead of thinking of an alternative strategy, taking a different route through the forest, or even finding a way to circumvent Serebryanski entirely and catch Ukraine out with some sort of tactical flanking maneuver, the Kremlin's commanders persist with tired, wasteful, and downright incompetent decisions. As long as the Russians continue down this same path, Ukraine's forces will have little to no trouble continuing to wipe them out, and this is almost entirely thanks to Ukrainian drone operators. Kyiv's fighters on the ground have even admitted that without the drones, their defenses probably wouldn't be strong enough to hold out in the area for too long. They would crumble under the sheer weight of enemy troops and equipment. But with drone operators working around the clock, using their eyes in the skies to scan the ground, spot Russian troops and take them out, the Ukrainian defenses are standing strong, and each successful strike buys Ukraine more time to solidify its position, resupply its units, and prepare for the next assault. And because of this, Yampil remains in Ukraine's hands, and is likely to stay that way for the foreseeable future, as the Russians repeatedly struggle to establish any sort of meaningful foothold in the area. It's exactly the same sort of situation that's being played out up and down the front lines. In the Pokrovsk area, for example, situated southwest of Yampil, Russian forces have been trying for months now to establish a foothold and force Ukraine's defenders out of the city, so they can then use it as a base for launching successive attacks deeper into Donetsk. But they've been utterly unable to do so, even after amassing a massive force in the area, with some estimates putting the numbers at more than 110,000 troops. Russia hasn't yet taken Pokrovsk. It's tried repeatedly, and it's even shown some willingness to test out different strategies, using everything from drones to artillery and even tanks or small units of disguised soldiers tasked with sneaking into the city to sabotage it from within. Nothing has worked, and Ukraine's defenders have used their knowledge of the area, their all-important home field advantage, to enjoy tactical superiority over their opponents. So, even though Russia has the numbers, the resources, the manpower, none of that is enough to achieve any sort of notable victory. Instead, the numbers of Russian losses, both in terms of personnel and equipment, just keep on rising. Ukraine's drones keep on raining down fire from above. And these sorts of stalemate situations play out day after day and night after night. Russia is getting nowhere fast, and it's paying a gigantic price despite making very little or no progress in the areas that matter most. This truly is one of the most wasteful war efforts ever seen involving a major military nation, and it shows no signs of improving. Ukraine, meanwhile, continues to demonstrate the kind of tactical intelligence and ingenuity that the country has become synonymous with. Even when it seems to be on the verge of a defeat, it finds ways to turn harsh situations and adversity in its favor. In Serebryanski, for example, any observer would have thought that Russia was in the ascendancy when it forced Ukraine soldiers out of the area. They were seemingly chased out by a stronger opponent, forced to give up valuable ground, or at least that's how it first appeared. In reality, Ukraine simply made the smart move. Its forces could have remained in the forest and conducted long, drawn-out battles with the enemy, likely losing a lot of lives and supplies in the process. That's exactly what Russia would have done. But Ukraine doesn't operate like Russia. Its commanders prefer to think 2, 3, 4 steps ahead, rather than focusing purely and simply on the present moment. For them, it's not simply about holding the most territory, it's about making the most of the territory they have. That's why they made the tactical decision to call the troops out of the forest, and then found ways to make that forest a genuine death trap for the enemy. They lured Russians into using the exact same routes and pathways that they had used before, turning what seemed like a weakness into an invaluable advantage. Now, yet again, it's Ukraine in the power position, and Russia struggling to survive, as its squads are torn apart by Ukraine's drones before they can build up any sort of momentum. The Serebryanski forest was supposed to be Russia's springboard for attacks on Yampil and beyond. Instead, it's turning into a slaughterhouse. Now, learn more about the disastrous realities of the war from Russia's perspective in our recent video, digging into the leaked Russian data that reveals just how big the Kremlin losses have been in 2025. Or for more insight into how Ukraine is turning the tables on its enemies, check out this video, which looks at the recent massive drone attack that Kyiv launched on targets in Crimea and Russia. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel too, so you can stay informed and up to date on everything that's happening in the Russia-Ukraine war and other important conflicts worldwide.